One thing that I've been working on, and many others have worked on for almost centuries, is this question of the legitimacy of the claim to sovereignty by the state. What it's so easy to see is that the claim to sovereignty over Aotearoa is illegitimate, but it's also illegal in accordance with international law, in accordance even with British law at the time, not least breach of tikanga Māori, obviously, also. So there's no legality to the Crown's claim to sovereignty and that imposition of a constitution either. But the question is, what do we then do about that? And I think that's what we're trying to discuss at the Constitutional Kōrero. Te Tiriti o Waitangi was meant to be about two governance groups, Pākehā, the Crown, and Māori coming together to share authority. You also saw the idea that the Crown would, at that stage at least, have full authority over Pākehā who were coming into Aotearoa, so the settlers, and Māori would retain authority, our mana, rangatiratanga, over our own peoples. And that we don't see, obviously, at all through this imposition of the Crown's power over Māori.
So I think one of the problems that we have is when we think about law, we think about a court and a judge or a police car or a big book. Law is really about people and about relationships. Constitutions are not the property, sole intellectual property of Western Europe. Any society of people, if they want to live in harmony, will come up with a set of values or a way to live.
New Zealand's current constitutional arrangement is the Westminster constitutional arrangement that we inherited. It's about ensuring that Parliament has the ultimate power. That's a really important and distinctive thing about New Zealand's constitution. Contrary to Te Tiriti o Waitangi, it doesn't allow any forms of autonomy or self-determination or self-governance for Māori.
So the Constitutional Kōrero Conference is a 3-day event happening up in Tāmaki Makaurau, and we've invited a lot of different people from across the world to come and talk to us about their missions for constitutional transformation and efforts to restore Indigenous mana. So it's a big pool of sharing, of listening and learning. And the conversation is about, okay, so how do we actually honour Te Tiriti? Not how do we co-opt Te Tiriti into this Westminster Constitution.
Hello. Claire Charles. Well, I've read a bit about you and seen you a few times.
I'm sure. Kia ora.
Hello. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming to see us.
So I just went up and talked to the protesters who are here on, I guess, on an anti-Te Tiriti campaign. I guess because I think that it's important to manaaki everyone who comes along. Also, I believe in freedom to say what you want to say. And obviously we contest views and there will be that expressed, I guess, today. But I think it's really important to have that conversation. Here we will ask ourselves, what would a Te Tiriti-based Aotearoa New Zealand look like? And how do we realise it? Answering these questions will require us to think deeply about our vision for our nation and how to design our own unique constitutional structures that are right for us, our lands and our identity as a Pacific nation of Polynesian and settler whakapapa.
I wanted to start with this quote from Moana. Without political authority, justice is a meaningless concept. Without the independent right to define justice and determine how it may be achieved, a people remain trapped in injustice.
When constitutions or laws recognize Indigenous peoples and their rights, they are affirming rather than creating those rights. Those rights are inherent and inalienable.
In modern constitutions, the recognition of Indigenous rights ranges from non-existent to quite general. At the one end is Canada's constitution, which generally recognizes, quote, existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. At the other end is Ecuador's 2008 constitution, which includes numerous articles covering a range of rights of Indigenous peoples in significant detail.
And many, but not all of these states have also developed legislative acts and guidelines to implement those rights stated in the Constitution. Constitutional recognition alone is not sufficient to respect self-determination, but it does require other mechanisms like legislation.
I think you can look across Indigenous country worldwide. You can find examples of assertions of self-determination, and you'll find success stories of Native nations, Indigenous nations, achieving their goals on their own terms.
I think evidence over the past, 40, 50 years now shows that almost all Indigenous peoples do better when they're regulating themselves, be it across health, education, criminalisation, incarceration, justice, and so on, do so much better when we have authority over ourselves.
The United States is interesting in a lot of ways. In many respects, tribes have a great deal of power and autonomy.
In the modern era, there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. The 574 within limits have broad ability to be creative, to be progressive, really to experiment in terms of democracy, representative democracy, legal and political philosophies.
The recognition by the United States does matter to those 574 federally recognized tribes. And one of the reasons it matters is because we are engaged in a government-to-government relationship with the United States. We entered into treaties with the United States as nations, not as racialized groups of people, but as nations, as Indian nations.
In 1978, we had an amazing constitutional convention. As a result, our Constitution strongly affirms Native Hawaiian rights. Protections have been extended to practices exercised for subsistence, cultural, and religious purposes. So this is everything that we need to survive and thrive, from Mocha to Makai, so from the mountains down out into our sea. Are they a silver bullet? No. Have they been helpful? Yes. And where folks get it wrong, at least these provisions give us specific legal handles to be able to enforce our rights.
Our peoples have the longest, oldest continuing culture on the planet. It's not only culture that is the oldest, it's also the oldest continuing law. First law demands that we do not centre ourselves. Country is centred. We are in relationship with country.
Our fundamental position in terms of the Australian legal system is that we've never ceded our sovereignty, and there is nothing that the state can do to cede our sovereignty. The voice to Parliament was very much rooted in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and how we're able to participate in the decision-making of the state.
How do we live together across difference? It has to do with radical co-presence. Now, this is a term that I learned from Boaventure de Souza Santos when he talks about abyssal thinking. So abyssal thinking, he says, is where the way we construct our understanding of the world and our reality erases others. The antidote to that is radical co-presence. What are all of the ways that we can deliberately and explicitly build relationships that make visible others and all that enables those other people to be a people? Law, political ordering, social ordering.
For a lot of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, they've been fighting the battles that we've been fighting for 500 years longer. So they have so much more experience, and they have, some of their thinkers are just, I've always found, are streets ahead of us, and with the clarity of thinking that they have, there are a number of Indigenous writers who definitely, reading them kind of lifts my spirits because they have an absolute clarity of vision. They'll call things out in ways that we don't do. So we're the lucky ones that people have come here to share their experiences and their insights.
Many of these constitutions are known as plurinational constitutions. So they recognise a plurality of nations within one territorial space.
In 1998, Oaxaca passed the first indigenous law in Mexico, recognizing the right to self-determination for indigenous peoples. This law effectively recognized the de facto existence of legal pluralism in Mexico.
What does plurinationality mean? Inside that word, we recognize the pre-existence of the indigenous people. And we are still nations. We are still alive. Also, we include all of the indigenous rights, lands, territories, cultural and linguistic rights. That includes legal system of indigenous people.
The direction that Greenland is moving in is undoubtedly towards greater self-determination. And everybody who has been part of this work have gradually realized that it takes longer than anyone had imagined. I would actually describe this process that we're in as being, the process itself being as important as the end result that we are going to have.
A party with majority in parliament may come up with a constitution that already consolidates power to themselves, and there will be power imbalance. The central success of a constitution making really is an avoidance of a unilateral exercise of power.
There is actually a relatively strong constitutional and legal recognition of the Sami as a people with self-determination rights. But then this recognition has not been translated into practical consequences.
Crown sovereignty is actually a grey space. There's lots of grey spaces that you can occupy and we can occupy with an assertion of sovereignty. Tino rangatiratanga can be achieved well before 2040.
For me, the whole issue is that we can't even have a quality or decent debate, about this in wider Aotearoa because of how the Crown education system has continued to perpetuate this level of ignorance. Oh yes, we'll have your reo, we'll have your language, and we've also seen, and yes, we'll have some of your tikanga because we recognise that at law. As law, aren't we so wonderful? But, they're not constitutional developments, those are settler moves to innocence. In a way that removes us from that colonial past, but actually just continues with the same power relations that we have. As long as that dynamic and these myths are in place, whānau, we're never going to be able to progress.
We've been thinking and talking about this really since the beginning of colonisation in our country, so these are not new conversations for us.
And let's start with the broken promises that we promised to our ancestors.
Yeah.
Hey, that they didn't adhere to, they didn't do.
For me, the first change has to happen in the hearts and minds of everybody in our country, but particularly those who hold decision-making power.
The Crown and all the beneficiaries of the Crown need to accept and acknowledge that they are exceeding kāwanatanga, that they are abusing their authority.
There is an awakening that's happening in Aotearoa. It's built on mutual respect and understanding, whanaungatanga, manaakitanga, but it must be actualised. Our destiny is actually cemented, embedded in the past, starting with he whakaputanga if you want to look at constitutional documents and its sister document, Te Tiriti o Waitangi.
And the dreams of our people are really quite simple. All we're asking to do is to make our own decisions for our own lives and our own resources.
Constitutional transformation, I think, has two sides to it. There's the side of decolonisation, where we're fighting against systems that have been imposed upon us. And then on the other side, we have this effort for reconnection and restoration of Indigenous values. That looks like learning to grow your mara, learning your reo, learning your whakapapa, stories about yourselves. It's a really exciting place to be putting our energy because it's fighting for something or growing towards something.
Constitutional moments sometimes come from moments of crisis. We're asking for constitutional moments to come from moments of hope and planning.
I think we need to listen to one another and take seriously what we say to one another. So often these discussions around constitutional transformation end up in a swamp of allegations of racism, of separatism, of apartheid even. That means that we're not listening to the deep claims or the deep claims to justice that are behind some of this discussion.
What we need to be doing is having constitutional kōrero and dreaming bigger, imagining.
So the question becomes, how do we share space together peacefully over time and over difference?
I want to go back to Moana, whom we just miss so dreadfully. And just to say from him, perhaps our biggest challenge is that we do not get constrained by what the government says our treaty relationship might be. We do not get limited by what others tell us the future might be. We do not get hamstrung by the notion of what people say is unrealistic or realistic. But we dare to dream. We dare to imagine something different, because the future in the end will be whatever we imagined it to be. Nō reira, ku mihi atu ki a koutou katoa, the kōrero, the conversation must go on.